So you'd probably never expect the most emotionally distant attachment style to fall into a state of obsession, but it does actually happen. And when it does, it can be intense, confusing, and incredibly contradictory. So in today's video, we are going to break down what happens when an avoidant falls into limerence, specifically a dismissive avoidant. We'll start by talking a little bit about what limerence actually is, and then we'll talk about the key signs and characteristics that this is showing up with a dismissive avoidance specifically, because as you can probably imagine, dismissive avoidants tend to keep their limerence hidden the most and for the longest period of time. Then we'll go into a little bit of the behavioral signs and actual triggers that can cause a dismissive avoidant to fall into limerence in the first place. In other words, the things that they'll often fall into limerence over. And then we'll talk about why it rarely leads to real intimacy and what happens when it all falls apart. So first and foremost, if you're new to this channel, my name is Thais. Welcome. I put daily videos out here all about attachment styles, the subconscious mind, how we can really heal and change our attachment style, not just how we can identify with our attachment style label and make it into our identity. And that is one of the key differences in something in the body of work I created called integrated attachment theory. So I hope you get a lot of value out of this video today. And if you do, I hope you subscribe. So first and foremost, if you're not familiar with the topic of limerence, really what limerence is it's this obsessive, kind of involuntary state of infatuation driven by this rich fantasy world where there's a deep desire for reciprocation, for love, for connection. And it's really marked by idealization, intrusive thoughts, and big highs and lows of emotions. And that can include for a dismissive avoidant. Of course, it will be relative to the fact that they are a dismissive avoidant, right? They're going to have less peaks and valleys in their highs and lows than you would see in an anxious attachment style, for example. But the big difference between love and limerence is that love is reciprocal. Love is usually an investment. There's a deep getting to know somebody and really understanding their flaws and fears, understanding a person as a whole and coming into relationship with their wholeness. Whereas limerence is very much based in, I met you briefly or maybe had limited interactions with you. I may not even know that much about you, but I'm projecting this image or this idea of who I think you are. And then in this fantasy world, I connect to who I think you are, who I imagine you to be. And really, I'm falling in love with that image. It's much more based in fantasy than in reality. And because there's this idealization, you're usually really filtering out this idea that anybody even has flaws that you're in limerence with. Okay. So, how does this actually show up when it comes to dismissive avoidant attachment styles? Well, although it's slightly more rare, it's definitely not impossible. And what's really interesting is that one of the biggest places dismissive avoidants are drawn to people from is when somebody else is unavailable. And that can be because that person is a movie star, somebody on television, somebody who's like a character that dismissive avoidance can really fall into limerence with. And they're really painting their own version of who this character is. But unfortunately, dismissive avoidants often fall into limerence too when they themselves are unavailable because they're in a committed relationship or they fall into limerence with people who are in committed relationships. And part of what's driving this dynamic forward is that there's this ability to connect to somebody in a fantasy without ever having to deal with their own fears of being vulnerable and really do the work to let someone in and really bond with them, which is part of why it kind of feels safer to be in limerence at times for a dismissive avoidant than it does to be in real love, because they don't have to deal with their fears of vulnerability or their wounds or their different concerns. And so because there's this way that limerence tends to manifest kind of privately for a dismissive avoidant, not only will other people not usually know that they're in limerence, but they will often fall into limerence with people who are literally not available to them. So since it can be so difficult to tell whether or not a dismissive avoidant is actually in limerence, I'll share with you a few types of signs that you would tend to see. So the first and foremost sign that you'll see is that there's this hyper focus on the person. And although that can fly under the radar, you may see things like if you're the object of limerence for a dismissive avoidant, they're constantly like looking at you. If you work with them, they're constantly staring at you. Maybe you find that they kind of like try to ask you questions about yourself that are deeply personal, which is really rare for a dismissive avoidant or somebody standoffish to begin with. You can see these sort of signs that they almost feel like they know you. And they may say things like, oh, how's your family doing? And they don't really know you well enough to be asking those kinds of questions. Like those are definite signs of someone being in limerence. But other things are checking social media. I mean, if you see somebody liking every single one of your posts or watching every single one of your stories, that can be a huge thing. If you see the signs that a dismissive avoidant is over analyzing your interactions, like Again, especially because dismissive avoidants are not ones to really overanalyze their person to person interactions. If you see a dismissive avoidant, be like, yeah, yesterday when we talked, I wasn't really myself. And here's what happened and here's why. And they're like, they're justifying or analyzing themselves. I mean, that's a huge sign. And then also, if you see them, like if you're the friend of a dismissive avoidant instead, and you hear them like constantly trying to talk about one person or bring the conversation back to them, usually dismissive avoidants aren't like super interested in people. They're not really ones to be like, oh, I want to know, fearful avoidance on the other hand, they just like want to know everything about everybody all the time because they're so curious about people a lot of the time. But dismissive avoidance are generally individuals who are not. So if they constantly are like asking about somebody, asking their friends about them, kind of talking about them, a lot of these things could indicate that there could be some actual signs that the dismissive avoidant is in limerence. Okay. And again, you'll see a lot of the like reaching out in these indirect ways, like sending a meme all the time or trying to like make someone laugh or like really getting a lot of how that person reacts to them. If they're in a group of people, constantly like stare, you catch them staring at you or making eye contact, like all of these things are definitely signs of limerence. Okay. Now, here's something really interesting. Here are the actual triggers that often cause limerence in a dismissive avoidant. And maybe I'll make a whole separate video of this that like breaks this down further. But generally, what you're seeing is dismissive avoidance will fall into limerence with people who, number one, are super warm or super supportive. If somebody's really warm, really caring, really gets like emotional for you, happy about the things you're happy about, excited about the things you're excited about, really feels for you and feels sadness for the things you're sad about. Dismissive avoidants aren't going to show it on their face, but those are definitely going to be points where they easily fall into limerence, where they're like, whoa, and they feel something like that very quickly. And this is because it's a deep unmet need for them to have their emotions mirrored back to them by other individuals. It was definitely something they were missing from their caregivers, and yet it is something that we are biologically wired for. So when that's being mirrored back from somebody who's a dismissive avoidant, that really lands deeply. Number two, you'll also see dismissive avoidants can fall into limerence more frequently with people who give that warmth, give that affection, give that supportiveness, but and give that mirroring of emotions and empathy, but also are inconsistent. Because usually dismissive avoidants, like they don't want to feel like somebody's too much like that all the time. Instead, they usually want something they can't have because it creates a sense of like, oh, I would like that, but there's also distance, so it doesn't have to make me feel threatened or afraid. And so if it's inconsistent, if there's inconsistency or if it's sort of there and then not there, that can cause them to feel like, oh, I have all these feelings towards somebody like that, but they're not activating my fears, and they're more likely to fall into limerence as a result. And then also, limerence can also be, something for a dismissive avoidance if they feel like somebody's giving them acceptance. They're not judging, they're very accepting. They are very open, enthusiastic. They make them feel validated or important or really seen or noticed. All of these things are huge things that will cause a dismissive avoidant to go into limerence. So at the end of all of this, okay, and I want to touch on this last really important piece. By the way, if you're somebody struggling with limerence, and you want to do a deeper dive into this, I have a whole course you can check out fully for free, just all about limerence. And that course is available right now as a part of our 14-day free trial for Mental Health Month, which is May, where we're literally opening up the doors to PDS to give you access to all of our courses, but specifically this one is in there if you type in limerence on your dashboard, and it's you'll be able to get through at least 2 courses in this period of time. If you just want to like check it out, dive in there. We do this, once or twice a year, and now's the time. So make sure you don't miss out. And this course on limerence specifically will help you so much to understand why the things you're in limerence over are so representative of unhealed wounds within you and usually deeply unmet needs from childhood, and how in healing those things, you are literally creating a foundation to foster so much more secure relationships where you feel so much more confident and don't lose yourself in the process by doing this work, which in turn allows your relationships to have a much better chance at lasting. So anyways, I'll put the link down below if you want to check that out fully for free just for a limited time. So when it ends, what happens? Generally, you will see dismissive avoidants go very, very cold. They will diminish as much as they can in terms of their attachment needs to their object of limerence. They will basically go stone cold, stonewall the person. And often what ends up happening is the limerence ends because they feel like they've lost control emotionally, or they feel a sense of shame around the way that they're feeling. And it just triggers this deep freeze response and causes them to feel like I need to shut down, I need to escape, I need to get as far away as possible so that I don't have to feel these emotions that make me feel out of control of myself, because that is something dismissive avoidants really don't like to feel. And so when they start to really feel like that and they go off that sort of edge of feeling like that too much or for too long, or where they're not getting enough positive reinforcement back, that is where they will go stone cold and often everything in their interactions will end with that object of limerence. So that is it for today. Let me know your questions in the comments below so I will make more videos about those things. I'll definitely go through and answer some of your questions as a whole. Thank you so much for stopping by and for watching. I hope you like, share, and subscribe to this channel, and I will see you next time.